So hello, everyone. My name is Janelle Jones, and I am the chair of the Professional Development Task Force for the Association for Adult Development and Aging, as well as a 2020 AMCD mentee. I will be moderating today's panel discussion. Before we begin, I did want to inform you all that today's session is being recorded. So I ask that all attendees please keep their microphones muted throughout the presentation. So welcome again to today's Association for Adult Development and Aging and Association of Multicultural Counseling and Development panel discussion, promoting multiracial solidarity, conversations for healing Black and Asian communities with Dr. Christian D. Chan, Dr. Lee Hughes, Dr. Stacey, Diane Arañez Litam, and Dr. Rufus Spann, as well as myself, Janelle Jones, the moderator. Again, as the webinar commences, you may type any questions you have for our panelists in the chat box. And if there's time at the end of the discussion, we'll be asking those questions. So it is now my pleasure to introduce our panelists to you all. Dr. Christian D. Chan is an assistant professor in the Department of Counseling and Educational Development at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro, president of the Association for Adult Development and Aging, and a proud queer person of color. As a scholar activist, his interests revolve around intersectionality, multiculturalism in counseling practice, supervision, and counselor education, social justice and activism, career development, critical research methodologies, and couple and family and group modalities within socialization and communication of cultural factors. So dedicated to mentorship for leaders and scholars, he has actively contributed to over 50 peer-reviewed journals, books, and edited volumes, and has conducted over 120 refereed presentations at the national, regional, and state levels. He is currently serving on editorial boards for the Journal of Counseling and Development, Counselor Education and Supervision, Journal of Multicultural Counseling and Development, Journal of LGBTQ Issues in Counseling, Adult Spann, Journal of Counseling, Sexology and Sexual Wellness, Research, Practice, and Education, and Asian Pacific Career Developmental Journal. Thank you again for being here with us, Dr. Chan. We also have Dr. Lee Hughes, who serves as a 2020-2021 president for the Association of Multicultural Counseling and Development, a division of the American Counseling Association. She's a tenured track assistant professor in the Department of Mental Health Counseling at Clark Atlanta University in Atlanta, Georgia. She earned her bachelor's at Spelman College in 1991, her master's at Georgia State University in 2008, and her doctoral degree at the University of Georgia in 2015. Dr. Lee Hughes successfully met the standards for her third year review at the University of Texas, San Antonio in the spring of 2018, where she was a qualitative methodologist on 10 dissertation committees. Dr. Lee Hughes' research centers on the expansion of social justice and cultural responsivity within counseling and related professions. More specifically, her research focuses on women of color across the lifespan, the impact and efficacy of group practices based on positionality, women in leadership, collaboration and counselor education, queer couples, and best practices in qualitative methodology in counselor education. She has published and presented in each of these domains. Dr. Lee Hughes' clinical work is largely informed by womanist, relational, cultural, and postmodern theories. It is wonderful to have you here with us, Dr. Lee Hughes. Thank you.
Thank you.
We have Dr. Stacey Diane Arañez Litam, who is an assistant professor of counselor education at Cleveland State University. Dr. Litam is a nationally recognized researcher, educator, and clinical counselor, as well as social justice advocate on topics related to human sexuality, sex trafficking, multicultural issues, and intersectionality. As a researcher and scholar, Dr. Litam's work has been published in prestigious journals such as the Journal of Counseling and Development, the Professional Counselor, the International Journal for the Advancement of Counseling, Counseling Outcome Research and Evaluation, the Journal of Sexual Aggression, the Journal of Counseling, Sexology and Sexual Wellness, and the Journal of Child Sexual Abuse. She has facilitated many refereed presentations at the international, national, regional, and state levels, and she actively contributes to peer-reviewed publications in journals, books, and edited volumes. Her professional interests are derived and include topics related to human sexuality, human trafficking, decolonizing the model minority stereotype, and mitigating the effects of COVID-19 related racism in Asian American Pacific Islander communities. Thank you for being here with us today, Dr. Litam. Last but not least is Dr. Rufus Spann, who is a founding team member and former chief clinical officer of Peril, a digital health platform for people of color. Currently, Dr. Spann is an assistant professor at the University of Southern California. Dr. Spann is a part of a research team that looks to develop a new instrument that measures clients' perceptions of whether counselors are effective in their ability to discuss the contextual dimensions of race, ethnicity, and culture with clients. Dr. Spann is a nationally certified school psychologist and a licensed professional counselor. He is owner of a successful private practice and has assisted many therapists of color in receiving their independent licenses. Thank you for being here with us today, Dr. Spann. With no further ado, we will go ahead and get our discussion started. So I would first like to pose the following question. Although anti-Asian discrimination in the US has recently attracted more media attention, these experiences are hardly the first time Asian Americans have faced racial bias. To contextualize the purpose of these experiences, what is the history of anti-Asian discrimination in the US?
I can start here. So when I think about the history of anti-Asian discrimination in the US, yes, we're seeing a lot of this in the media, which began perhaps in March of 2020, and we're seeing a resurgence of anti-Asian hate more recently. And yet this isn't the first time that we're seeing this presence of discrimination against Asian Americans, primarily Chinese Americans in the US. All the way back to the 19th century, we had what was called the Yellow Peril myth, which really framed Asian Americans, primarily again, Chinese immigrants and Chinese migrants, as being existential threats to the Western society. So as part of this, Asians were presented as dangerous, dirty, infectious, and unworthy of American citizenship. And so, yes, again, we're seeing a resurgence of anti-Asian discrimination, but this isn't the first time that Asian Americans have been targeted and that we're seeing xenophobic rhetoric in the US narrative.
So one of the main pieces I also want to highlight too is if anybody's familiar with what had occurred with Vincent Chin several decades ago, that I think in many capacities, it was certainly not treated as a hate crime, even though there were racial slurs thrown out, even though there were specific instances of very severe physical violence. And the claim was that, there was a point of self-defense and that Vincent Chin was established as someone who was seen as threatening. And I think this is also roped into this whole idea of what we see that's cultivated, particularly for Asian American and Pacific Islander communities, as not just what we see in the Yellow Peril, what we have delineated as the Yellow Peril, but also what is established as the convergent forces of racism and nativism, right? So when we think about racist nativism as a part of that history. And so as we think about the goals of today and what kind of community and solidarity we're cultivating here, this is also about really understanding the history that has been embedded in racist nativism. One where, as we talk a lot about what happens across several Black, Indigenous communities of color, there's also this element of still continuing to be on the fringes, to be perceived, and not just perceived, but treated as outsiders, right? Within a system, a place that we call home.
And just to add from my understanding of historical context, because I always loved history, if we think about at the time of the United States, particularly around our wars, like World War II, we think about Vietnam War, we think about like particularly the concentration of Asian Americans, particularly thinking about more of Japanese and putting them in what were concentration camps in many ways. And then also thinking about what is that to other and having the stereotypes and historical, as Dr. Litam has already mentioned, what does that mean for how that filters within to our culture and our country? But I think it's a history that sometimes is lost as we think about how dominant narratives are put out there. But the marginalization and the othering has always been a factor. But I think what's happening now is that we're really getting back into talking about this in a way where we're bringing solidarity and trying to move forward in a way that identifies history, but getting back into currently how people are experiencing this right now.
And so I have been the last one to speak because I do not have a wealth of context for the historical context of what it means to be a member of the AAPI community. within the United States. I don't want to present myself as such. And I am a narrative researcher who grew up right here in the United States, born in 1967. So I've experienced the incorporation of multicultural communities growing up in a city like DC, where Blacks and Asians have always lived collaboratively. So my knowledge base is more so from experience. And for me, as a young person growing up, what I knew of the AAPI community was, and I'm going to kind of be controversial, right? Because AAPI communities owned stores and businesses in Black communities in a large percentage, and we were together daily. And so this idea that there is something a myth between the Black and Brown communities is just a myth. And that's really the context I'm going to be coming from for this next hour. Although I don't have all of the knowledge, the relationships are pure and contextual, which is why we're here today. And this idea that we are here in this time where we're having these violent kind of instances, I think this is where we get deeper into the idea that white supremacy is toxic to everybody, and it's a trickle down. It's the only thing that trickles down in this country is the ill effects of a supremacist society. And so I'm gonna stop because I could go on, but I'm looking forward to the next question.
Wonderful. So to jump right into that next question, I would like to know, how have Asian American identities been weaponized by white supremacists to discount Black experiences and invalidate Black oppression? Yes, that question. And then we'll move to the next that is also on this slide.
So that's exactly what I was saying. I mean, and this is kind of how I am always as a professor. I'm always answering the question right before it gets answered, before it gets asked, right? But that is, I guess, my issue, because everyone on this call is a personal friend and colleague, and it's not about us trying to prove our solidarity. It's organic. Okay, I met Christian Chan as the scholar and emerging leader that he's still always an emerging leader because we're always arriving, right? However, we were in doc programs. I was about to graduate. He was new. And we met at a counter and struck up a conversation that has ended in an enduring relationship. And so the concept that there is a basic disparity between these communities is mythology. And I hope today we are really kind of wiping that, kind of cleaning the record there, because white supremacy is toxic, and it kind of assigns separations where we could be building bridges.
Yeah, and I love that you mentioned that, Dr. Lee Hughes, about how the presence of white supremacy has created barriers between multiracial unity by positioning Asian American identities and weaponizing them against Black American identities. So when I think about how this has historically been weaponized, I think about the presence of the model minority myth. So just a quick little historical overview of where the model minority myth came from. It was really around the civil rights era when Black Americans were saying, hey, we're experiencing systematic racism, we're experiencing discrimination, we're experiencing police brutality, we need you to do something else. White people, help us do something. And in response, white supremacists said, actually, you're doing just fine, because look at these Asians. These are model minorities. These are individuals who work hard, who are universally successful, hardworking, who have two-parent homes. If you just work a little harder, then you can be a model minority. But by creating model minorities, what ends up happening is this false dichotomy of, if you're not a model minority, you become a problem minority. So as a result, the Asian American identity has historically been weaponized in a way that discounts, invalidates, and makes the experiences of Black Americans invisible. The model minority myth is the weapon that white supremacists use to say, if you just work harder and pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you too can be successful. But they don't take into account that not everyone has boots, not everyone has bootstraps.
You know, I want to add to this, and also thinking about, as Dr. Lippman does work in this, when we think about colonization, and if we think about global colonization, if we think about Central Powers from England, France, Spain, and what was the ideal look, the ideal person, which would be white male, how that has really soaked into a lot of cultures across diasporas. And what does that mean for, as we look at each other as people of color? And I've loved that that term came into play and we stopped using minorities, because in the solidarity of people of color, and still thinking about bringing out the identities within that, as we think about Black, Asian, AAPI, and just thinking about, one, the whole issue around that and white supremacy and the ideal, what it is to be closer to white identity, that kind of pitting and kind of using that within people of color causes this kind of issue of being one's better than the other. But at the same time, realizing that there's always been levels of solidarity, because we know that within our heritage, within our differences, that makes us who we are. But at the same time, finding spaces of similarities and realizing that there's levels of oppression that we're all experiencing if we are not that white male. And so I think that's a part of what tries to put the pitting globally against each other and thinking about who is considered in hierarchy. But the reality is that we really are in all this together.
What I have a lot of reflections swimming around in my mind right now. One of the pieces that I often think of, right, is part of what happens and part of what is so endemic about racism and white supremacy is that it continues to fester in so many ways, but here's how it also festers, right? It festers in the way that we internalize it. And actually, to me, that is even more dangerous, right? When Black, Indigenous communities of color, and we see this, right? And if we're not really understanding, like, here's the way that we've internalized white supremacy, then what we can do is, what happens is it removes us from the culpability to be in that solidarity, right? To know that that is an organic piece, just like Dr. Lee Hughes has shared, like that is ultimately a part of who we are. But also it removes us from that culpability, and people assume that it's an absolution of the culpability. But what it also does, it gives people the leeway to weaponize whiteness and white supremacy against several communities of color. And to me, that is the most dangerous and the scariest part about white supremacy, right? Is ultimately what we continue to infuse in our educational system, what we infuse in the workplace. And I think a lot about, if anybody's familiar, and I hope that if you're not, I hope that you take some time to read some of her work, but Grace Lee Boggs, right? So Grace Lee Boggs' work, particularly on talking about the next American Revolution, and really, like, the understanding here is that Grace Lee Boggs says, there's one element of us tackling experiences and policies, but it's also what really will also be a crucial part of this revolution is the culture that we dismantle, that's infused together with, or fused together with white supremacy.
Wonderful thoughts. And so much, I get, like Dr. Chan, as you mentioned, there's so many thoughts swimming around right now. I do want to ask the question, so it's not on the slides, but I do want to ask how anti-Blackness is perpetuated in Asian American communities, whether that is historically or currently. How is anti-Blackness being perpetuated?
I love that you asked that question, because I was just thinking about that. I was like, I need to add this in here, because when we think about the anti-Blackness, if we think about where positioning and as let's say the rung of where Blacks and the Black diaspora stands globally, we know that anti-Blackness is a global issue. And we know that culturally, that it's an identity and a problem that has been filtered throughout, the globe. But if we go historically, if we go thousands of years back, really, it was really a mixing, a melting pot of different hues, colors, and people. And that whole othering and trying to really say these are the nuances, the phenotypes and genotypes of people really wasn't the issue. But what we're finding out now is that now it's become a rung of saying these are a lower class of people, or these are a violent set of people, or these are the people that are going to attack you or take from you. And that level of fear is exactly a tactic that was supposed to be, well, it's been weaponized, it's been used. And so that's where a lot of for some communities see the anti-Blackness, is that there's a fear of Black people. There's a thought of lesser educated, that they cannot get along with other people. But we know that historically, that hasn't been the case, and that is not the case of Black people. But happenstance is that what's going on is that there's this perpetuation of a theory or a myth or an identity, which then causes other communities to feel that way, because maybe not interaction, you may have never met a Black person or interacted in that way. But I think Dr. Hughes has said many communities intermixing and it not being an issue.
I love what you mentioned, Dr. Spann, about how this fear of violence and danger tends to perpetuate and to be present in the minds of many non-Black individuals. And I once read that the only place where Black individuals are more dangerous are in the minds of non-Black people. But there is this insidious presence of anti-Black notions that are present across just about every distinct Asian American subgroup. So for instance, you think back to Takoa Ozawa, who's a Japanese man. Mr. Ozawa lived in the US for about 20 years, but in the early 20th century, the ability for someone to achieve US citizenship was only limited to free white persons and persons of African descent. And so when Mr. Ozawa went to court to advocate for his ability to become an American citizen, the system had not yet created the space for Asian Americans to exist and to thrive. And so it was interesting that rather than advocating for an identity as a white person, or excuse me, as a Black person, Ozawa advocated for himself as a white identity person. We also see experiences of what is referred to as colonial mentality among Filipino individuals. So Filipinos, we have been colonized multiple times, including by the US. We have been described as a land of America's little brown brothers. And because we have been denigrated for so long by white American mentalities, we tend to have this internalized belief that everything native and indigenous to the Philippines is bad and ugly and disgusting, and everything closer to whiteness, everything closer to proximity to whiteness is beautiful, attractive, and ideal. So even growing up, I was born in the Philippines. I came to America when I was young, and my mom still tells me, don't go outside for too long, you're gonna get too dark. And so she still will perpetuate these anti-Black notions and myths. We also see history of anti-Blackness, perhaps even in Korean communities following the 1992 Los Angeles riots, when, following the beatings of Rodney King, a Korean store owner fatally shot 15-year-old Latasha Harlins, and tension erupted among the Black and Korean American communities. Now, even though media really positioned this conflict between Asian Americans and Black Americans in the media, it was intended to detract from the real problem, which was the presence of white supremacy and police brutality on people of color. So there are a lot of, I could go on, Chinese Americans. We have the instance of Peter Liang being scapegoated against, shooting Akai Gurley in the New York stairwell. There's a lot of instances of anti-Blackness Asian American communities. And I think it's really important that as Asian Americans, we recognize and put a name to the privileges we are afforded because of our proximity to whiteness, and we learn to counter that and dispel that so that we can begin fighting white supremacy and overturn the presence of racism.
And I would say, especially as we think about our conversation, our reflections, our community here, I think about especially what we're also seeing in the chat too, right? Particularly as we think about what happens is that anti-Blackness shows up also in what we see as rooted or interlocking with colorism. And it's also in many capacities what creates this monolithic notion of what AAPI groups are, right? And so I think in that vein, that also shows up. I also, I appreciate everybody sharing or discussing particularly Claire Jean Kim's theory. She's a political scientist who talks extensively about the theory of racial triangulation, right? So, and essentially what that perpetuates, it is a vehicle for white supremacy. And what I also, what's also important to note about that is also what it perpetuates as oppression Olympics, right? That, you know, you can only like, if only these resources, right, are, if they're diverted from specific communities of color, then that means someone else is going to fail. And that's part of what we've adopted as this narrative, but then it's become a part of a larger social and structural problem, right? And so with that being said, I also want us to consider in terms of healing, right? Especially as today, as we're talking about healing and we're talking about solidarity, one of these concrete ways that I often think about is, how do we even refuse? Like, how do we systematically continue to refuse those social and structural policies, right? But also, how do we also refuse when it happens in our spaces, when it happens in our workspaces, our workplaces, our own personal contacts, our own friendships, and our communities? That's what we also have to do in terms of when we intervene in anti-Blackness, right? When we dismantle anti-Blackness, it is also a part of not only what we're doing within ourselves and within the structural systems that we're in, but also what we're doing in terms of the culture and what we're doing interpersonally.
Wonderful thoughts, everyone, and thank you all for sharing on that question. I think it's so important to this discussion. So I do want to then shift a little bit again towards the media and that influence that has in both communities, and perpetuating separation between those communities. So the media has chosen to highlight stories of Black on Asian crime. What are your thoughts on this?
You know, when I see that, my heart goes out to anybody that's in any situation where it's hurt, harm, or danger. And I want to acknowledge that there are people that are being hurt and harmed. And then I also acknowledge that the media has always been able to use images and always has done certain things within media and portrayal to stir up certain emotions and images, and how does that filter into society and into the public. However, we know that these things are actually happening, but the positionality of all of that and what's happening with the media, I do question what is the intention behind it. One, we need to get out the images and stories so that people understand that this is happening to people in Asian communities, and that we need to address the hurt, harm, and what is actually being impacted by people being hurt and their experiences. And then I also think about what is the intention behind that. And I think some of the intention behind that could be going back into creating this narrative. And what I mean by narrative is people already see Black people as aggressive. People already see Black people as you can't really trust them, or there's a fear of us. And so we don't know if all the crimes are Black people, and I can't just say that, but I do know that what's happening now is that there could be a perpetuation of that and how the media is positioning that. But I always acknowledge that people are being hurt, people are in hurt, harm, and danger in these situations. Then I still think about media-wise, what is the intention behind that? And what is it stirring up emotionally and causing a visceral reaction in their intentions?
I also wanted to, part of what I've been reflecting on in response to this question and Dr. Spann's points is part of what I'm concerned about, right, is the way how media portrays portrays particularly what we're seeing as like, if they're saying this is Black on Asian crime, my serious concern about this is that it's what Dr. Tamara Nopper talks about, right? It's a reinforcement of the carceral state. And essentially what we see as profiling, policies that and punitive practices that already profile Black and brown communities, right? So that already exists. And what the media, what people, if they're not careful and they're not aware, not only internally and within their own knowledge base, but also if they're not critical consumers of the media, what happens is that they can adopt that narrative and say that, you know, here's the problem, right? And then again, problematize Black communities. And then also, again, recreate that carceral state. And that's, to me, a serious problem.
I think Dr. Chan, as you mentioned, media portrayals, that like kind of brings us into our next discussion question. And of course, we can continue to ruminate on this question about the media and how it highlights Black on Asian crime. But how do these portrayals essentially further impact multiracial unity? And so thinking about how we're seeing Black on Asian crime, what is that doing for the unity that we're hoping to achieve? What is that doing for the solidarity that we're hoping to see in this world?
I think we have to be careful about who the we is, right? Because there is not a universal we. You know, my pronouns are we, us, and ours, but most of us identify ourselves singularly first. And that is exactly what this kind of a paradigm continues to create, is an individualistic perspective of what's in it for me at an exact time when we're seeing Black and brown people vote at historic numbers. And so it's not an accident that this is happening in the now. And we have to be informed consumers, as my panelists clearly are, and I'm sure our audiences as well. But as mental health practitioners, we are also bearing the brunt of what's happening to our communities as a result of this very individual focus. And that is the impact, in my opinion, of a white supremacist focus. It's always pushing Black and brown people to prove ourselves, extend ourselves beyond what is actually mentally and physically healthy. And when we are really trying to unpack these issues, we are often doing it so that we can, in a way, bring our white brothers and sisters in, which I'm all for that. But the work I am doing is really about the Black and brown people in the middle. And I hope the white people come too.
I think it's simple. If the media portrayals continue to focus on marginalized communities, fighting other marginalized communities, it distracts from the larger issues of police brutality and white supremacy. I mean, we had people storm the Capitol and walk away. That would not have happened if this was a majority of marginalized individuals.
The day that happened, Dr. Litam, I wrote a statement a couple of days later and posted it on AMCD Connect. And the kind of responses that I received, there was a wide array of responses. But what I left with is this sense that many of us of color are as indoctrinated with white supremacist values and aspirations, which keep tearing us apart internally. And so I'm really glad that you made that statement, because I make that statement almost daily, right? I do, and I have made that statement almost daily since I was in middle school. But what I have been seen as a troublemaker, a smart aleck, I talk too much, And I'm going to keep talking, but there is a real danger in taking that position. And I really appreciate my colleagues for standing in this space collectively.
I also want to echo that and saying this is exactly what we need to do. If the media or certain conglomerates of media want to show and have those kinds of images or conversations, we need to also have the counter conversations and images and get into other spaces where it's national and continue to have these larger conversations and to drown out and to show solidarity. So I think this is a perfect example. And I hope this is a wildstorm or wildfire that allows it to go and to continue to seep in spaces, and these conversations are continued and multiplied, because that's how we counteract what is a media narrative. We have to show solidarity, and we have to show it in platforms and show it in other spaces. So I think this is what we need to be doing and amplify it.
There's just one more thing that comes to mind, and I feel as though it would be a shame not to bring this up, but I am a firm believer that the media needs to stop showing violence on Black and brown bodies on the media, in the news. You know, I've done research, I've published research that shows that just witnessing violence to people that look like us can lead to secondary traumatic victimization. It can lead to post-traumatic stress symptoms. It can lead to symptoms of depressive disorders and lower life satisfaction. We need to stop seeing physical harm and violence enacted on the bodies of people that look like us. I think that's a really important part that I'd love to see us begin advocating towards as well.
I agree, Dr. Litam, and wonderful thoughts, you all. So I think that perfectly segues us into the space of healing, the space of solidarity, and thinking about how do we kind of start seeing that in these communities. So how can solidarity between Asian and Black communities be enacted now in our present, and then also maintained in the future?
I also want to dovetail this with Joyce's question about recommendations, insights for the healing process and practices for intergenerational and multi-generational families. I think in many ways, one of the pieces that I'm reflecting on is, so there's two aspects here for me, because I know we've been centering our conversation too, right, about dismantling white supremacy. And when we do that within our families, it also entails so much grief within our families. And we need to be able to work through that grief within our own families. And so sometimes in those pieces, like, we also know that our ability to heal is contingent on generations of healing, right, and surviving. And it's not just what we're doing to survive and heal now, but that we've also drawn from several kinds of tools for healing in the process and practices. I think about specifically among generations and families that, you know, if anybody's familiar with Tara Yoso's community cultural wealth framework, right, that arose from critical race theory, a lot of what that is centered on, you know, two components of that, for example, is navigational capital and resistant capital. And so remembering that so much of these tools that are passed down, the ways that we've practiced resistance isn't new. What we're doing is we're tackling an endemic problem, right? And sometimes even our own family members also have passed down those tools to us. I think the other piece here is when we think about, that's also connected to navigational capital. Our families have also taught us how to be savvy in terms of building networks of solidarity over the past several decades. They have also been the ones who have imbued us with the tools really to go even beyond, right, and to continue healing within ourselves. And so I will say, in navigating systems, right, systems that are not just rife with inequities, but systems that are certainly embedded with implicit and explicit forms of white supremacy. So our families are also telling those stories too. And it's it behooves us to listen to those stories and to know that that kind of cultural wealth already exists within our families. Sorry, there was one more piece I was going to share, but I lost it. So it'll come back to me. I think, yes.
So Dr. Chin, as you're talking about cultural wealth and really maybe even viewing yourself and your family history from a standpoint of immigration, right? As an African American, we don't really have that privilege, right? We didn't immigrate. We were stolen. So even though we have been here for 400 plus years and tend to exceed most other nationalities other than Native Americans because they were born here, right? We've been here 400 plus years. Most other immigrants have been here some other length of time, right? And not my expertise. However, when we're talking about spiritual legacy and the ability to call on that for strength, a lot of that's been stolen from our communities. We don't have the ability to track our lineage because we were even sold apart as families while we were here. So some of this deep and embedded pain that's happening in the African American community stems right there, right? We don't, I look at Henry Louis Gates weekly, right? And I'm always really interested in people's family lineages. And whenever there are African American people on these shows, there's this place we hit where we have to stop tracking, right? And so when we're talking about like generational pain and development, we need to be looking at the historical trajectories for both cultures, Black and Brown peoples, and how that has clashed in the possibility of now, right? We're dealing with Black Lives Matter. We're having a moment as Black people, and we want to be able to thrive and, kind of use that as a point of energy. And what happens? Boom, now we're having fights with people that are traditionally allies, right? And so I just want us to be really sensitive to the fact that this does not happen accidentally, and the damage is, the burden is carried within our own communities. And as healers, it's our responsibility to do something different. And it's nice that we are able to bring theory and history to the context, but it's also what are we doing on the ground now? And this webinar is one way we're doing it. And I am determined, as I always am, that it can't stop here.
Dr. Hughes, I so appreciate that you mentioned the distinctness of Black oppression. I think that that's really important to understand. And I also find that in the process and the experience of many other people of color or marginalized individuals, and I purposefully avoid the term minority. I avoid racial minorities, gender minorities, sexual minorities, because there's nothing minor about us. I prefer marginalized. And so I find that one of the challenges of marginalized identities in advocating for solidarity with the Black community is this sense of what I refer to as privilege guilt. There's this feeling of, I have too much privilege, especially for many East Asian Americans. I have too much privilege to be able to help. I can't possibly understand the challenges of being racially profiled to the extent that Black Americans are. I can't possibly understand not being able to track my lineage using 23andMe or Ancestry.com. It just stops at Africa, but which country? There's many. And I think that we cannot let that stop us. We cannot let the presence of our privilege silence our voices. And thick solidarity, as I conceptualize it, is the ability to mobilize our empathy in ways that acknowledge our racial differences, but while also emphasizing the specificity, irreducibility, and incommensurability of our racialized experiences.
Amen. So I like underserved as my terminology. And I want to go past empathy to compassion.
Love that. I'm here for it.
Also totally here for that. As we move towards the end of our time today, I guess one of the overarching questions, and I'm sure many of the attendees, based on some of the private messages and questions I've received, really wondering how can Black and Indigenous people of color communities, as well as allies, advocate for change and justice going forward? What are some actionable, meaningful steps we all can do?
Join AMCD and AADA and get on a committee like now. And this is just my little, and I'm not answering the question actually maybe, but that is the truth. We want you to join our division. We want you to not just join the division as a member, we want you to be active. And in my, few years as a student and as an educator, we frequently join committees as a way to benefit ourselves. It is a wonderful Vita builder, and I'm all for that. But it's time to get to the work. So let's join and be active in the process.
I agree. I think this conversation should be just one of many of thousands of conversations, and continue to grow the conversation and interrogate spaces where you don't see equity, social justice, where you don't see change, or if you don't see solidarity, bring it up. Do self-advocate as well as advocate for others. That's really what's going to make the difference, is that we have to come together in spaces and have conversations and create change. And then it needs to be action. It has to have continuity. And we have to continue to push it forward and continue to look at spaces where maybe we never thought that was an issue for people of color or BIPOC or issues of anti-Blackness, but step into those spaces and actually create change, enact change. And I think the best way to do that is also with larger organizations, as Kim has mentioned. That's how we're going to get things done. We have to come together and we have to continue these kind of conversations. Don't let this just be the conversation that you listen to. Create your own conversations and create it in other spaces.
And what I will also share too, something that is dovetailing with several of our colleagues, our community members here, something that I often think about, I reflect on, right, is when we employ the work of intersectionality, it isn't just about multiple identities or diverse identities. It isn't just about, okay, how is my experience unique, right? It's also about who we've missed, who's not just, and I don't even it's not even just who's invited to the table, but who's embraced at the table, right? Who will be allowed to do the work? Who will be allowed to be in this not just the conversation, but the work of justice. And so when we think about that, I often think about how we reflect intersectionality to really understand the structural issues, the social context, in terms of what systematically tethers us to our work, right? What connects us to that systematic agenda that really informs all the areas that we need to tackle, because it isn't just about the experience that is contained within our own lives, but it's also, or those intersections within our own lives, but also the reality of how so many of what we're seeing when we think about racism, anti-Blackness, colorism, genderism, classism, how they really do, they intersect and they also omit people's experiences when in so many capacities. And I think even now, right, something that was so meaningful that Dr. Kevin Nadal tweeted one of these other days was, talking about, that we have to keep pushing ourselves. We have to keep pushing ourselves to transform. And so what that means is what are we doing for Black trans women? What are we doing for trans Asian Americans? What are we doing for South Asians? So I think in this capacity, we are still pushing that agenda forward. And what I will also say is, in addition to joining AADA and AMCD and doing the work, right? I also, we also implore so many of our panelists but not just panelists, but our audience members, really to continue and cultivate this work, these conversations, and the work within your spaces. The work of justice takes all of us. It takes all of us.
Yes, I'm all about actionable steps. I find that it's frustrating when I attend a panel and I think, okay, I'm motivated, now what? So here are some clear actionable steps for all of you. Check out ihollaback.org. They offer free online and virtual trainings for bystander intervention. These trainings include bystander intervention when you're witnessing violence against Black and brown bodies. More recently, they have bystander intervention training for addressing anti-Asian discrimination following COVID-19. Other things we can do is avoid participating in the oppression Olympics. Remember that our proximity to privilege is not sufficient or a good reason to silence us. When I think about the more recent resurgence of anti-Asian hate, I think about the importance of legislative advocacy. And I think it's also really important that as Asian Americans, we are not calling for more police action. We want justice, but not at the expense of endangering our Black brothers and sisters. And so those are my three little invitations for you all.
So this brings us towards our final reflections for today. I know that many of you asked questions in the chat, and I know that our panelists did a great job of interweaving them throughout the conversation today. But I do want to ask them finally, do you have any final thoughts on this conversation on Black and Asian solidarity in America, anything?
I just wanted to thank you for making this, by the way. Everyone that did this, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. Okay.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I do have just one final thought. I'm just grateful that you all chose to take time out of your day in a pandemic when we're all experiencing trauma to share this space and to share this community. I think that many of us here are in mourning, we are in pain, we're tired, and we're struggling. And so my hope is that we all take care of yourselves, find some time. This is heavy stuff to talk about and think about. Remember that taking care of yourself, survival and self-preservation, those are acts of political warfare. And sometimes just getting through the day is good enough. So please take care of yourselves.
Wonderful thoughts. I do, oh, sorry, go ahead, Dr. Chan.
I was going to ask Dr. Spann and Dr. Lee Hughes if they had additional reflections to share as well. I think with some of what we're reflecting on today, healing is messy, it is complicated, it is hard, and to heal means that we dive into this process, this commitment of unlearning too, right? And at the same time, it is worth it. It is worth it. And healing takes community. It takes our heart to really know that our heart is in this work. And it takes that cultural change, right? But it takes our community together with us too.
So I was trying to get off before I started crying, and I didn't make it. And this does really, it weighs heavy on me. I work at a historically Black college and university. I teach a 3-3 load. I'm running a national organization, and I'm in a family with 3 generations in the household right now. I'm doing all of that, publishing and doing the work we're doing now. So what I want all of you to understand is the work can be done because it's the passion that keeps it going. It's not about time. It's really not even about energy anymore for me. It's about purpose. And although it is not easy, I'm on fire with purpose, and I'm going to do some more work when I get off the line. So I am so serious about the idea that we have to hold each other's hands and hold each other's hearts. And I am committed to that for all of you who are here today. And I thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you for that, Kim. And just really quick, I would just echo that. The love, the energy that we're getting in here, the compassion, the solidarity, please take that out and continue to let it shine in you and pull other people together so that we can continue these kinds of actions and conversations, because we can make change. We've done it before historically, and we will continue to do that. Let's just continue to bring each other together to make some things happen.
Wonderful. So I would like to thank you all, Dr. Chan, Dr. Lee Hughes, Dr. Litam, and Dr. Spann for this wonderful discussion today. On behalf of the Association for Adult Development and Aging and the Association for Multicultural Counseling and Development, I would like to thank everyone for attending today's discussion. We hope that this discussion highlighted the importance of solidarity and being active in dismantling racism that impacts our communities. And we all know that the work does not stop here. We hope that you will all continue these conversations with your peers, your students, your colleagues, your friends, your neighbors, etc. We will ensure that today's webinar that was recorded is uploaded to our YouTube, and I will be sending out a notification to you all via Eventbrite, the same way that you receive notifications about this meeting today and the Zoom ID. I will let you all know when the video is uploaded and include the link there so you can refer back to it. Thank you again, everyone, for being here today and continue doing the work towards solidarity. We appreciate you all. Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.